All right, Secretary Hagel, whenever you're ready.
I'm ready.
Sounds good. Hi, I'm Andrew Liang. Welcome back to another installment of the Distinguished Speaker Series. Today, I'm joined in Washington, D.C. by Chuck Hagel, our nation's 24th Secretary of Defense, a two-term U.S. Senator from Nebraska, and a decorated Vietnam War veteran, and one of the most renowned leaders in government of our generation. Secretary Hagel, thank you for the opportunity.
Andrew, thank you.
So I want to take you all the way back. How did you first get involved in government? What was the first step?
Well, when I came back from Vietnam and I was out of the Army, I went back to college, finished my degree at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And then I decided I wanted to go to Washington to look for a job to get into government and politics. I didn't know anyone. Came back here for a week. First time I'd ever been to Washington, knocked on doors, knocked on any door that would open. And to my great surprise, no one offered me a job. And everybody was nice to me, but I'm sorry we don't have any openings. I had no experience. I didn't know anybody. But I had later on, a few months later, a congressman from Omaha had just been elected, and he was on my radio show. I worked for a radio station, and I had told him I had been in Washington, and he said, well, I don't have a job for you, but he said, if you would want to come back to Washington and work part-time on my staff, I have questionnaires that have been coming back. I need someone to grade those questionnaires and go through the written responses. He said you could be in my office for half a day. He said you can live in my basement, and I'll give you $200 a month, and it won't cost you anything to live. Then you can look for a job. So not exactly the glorious triumphant entry into Washington I had in mind, but I thought that probably was a good start. So I packed up an old Chevy I had and didn't have much, and whatever I had, put it in the car and drove to Washington, moved into his basement. And this was in July 1971, and started looking for a job. But actually, a few months later, he offered me a full-time job. And a year later, I became his chief of staff, and I was his chief of staff for 5 years, and that's how I first got into government.
How did you come to join the Reagan campaign?
Well, he ran for the Senate in 1976 and lost. And then I was offered a job by Firestone Tire and Rubber Company to run their government affairs office. I was the youngest manager of government affairs in Washington, and I was the only government affairs manager, senior person for a corporation that reported directly to the chairman and the CEO. And I did that in the late 70s, and then in the 80s, during the primary campaign, and after or toward the end of the primary campaign, when it was clear Reagan was going to win, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Bill Brock, came to me, who I had known as a former senator, and asked me to take a leave of absence from Firestone and help with the Reagan campaign and the Republican National Committee. And I did, and became very close to the Reagan people, and ran a number of things for the Reagan campaign. And then after Reagan won, I was offered a job to be the Deputy Commissioner General for the World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee, which was in 1982. I accepted that, but in the middle of that, then I was offered a job by the Reagan administration to be nominated by the president to be the deputy administrator of the Veterans Administration. So I agreed to do that, was nominated by the president. I was confirmed by the Senate, and was the President Reagan's first deputy administrator of the Veterans Administration for a year. I was the highest ranking Vietnam veteran in the Reagan administration.
Wow. What kind of leader was President Reagan?
Well, first, he was a very real person, really a lovely man. He was a very decent man, and I always admired that, because in this business of politics, which is a tough business, and it hasn't gotten easier, and unfortunately, I think with conduct today, on both sides of the aisle with so many politicians, not all, we've seen a debasement of
Mhm.
politics, dignity, common courtesies,
Mhm.
respect for others' opinions, tolerance. We've lost a lot of that. And I always admired Ronald Reagan for those qualities first. He was tolerant and he was respectful of others. He had his own opinions. He felt strongly about different things, but he was fair. He was honest. He was a decent human being. I've always thought that those are the most important qualities that you look for in any leader, whether it's politics or any institution or any walk of life. And then you work it from there. I mean, I often hear over the years, well, that person's a very smart person. He ought to be or she ought to be in government or somewhere. I like smart people, but that's not my first criteria. As I often have said, I know a lot of smart people.
Mhm.
I wouldn't want a lot of them near power. Uh, Decency, honesty, integrity, character, courage, those are the first qualities you look for. He had all those. And he was really a pretty remarkable person. He got started later. I mean, he was the oldest president we've elected,
Mhm.
8 years. And I wasn't close to him, but I knew him pretty well
Mhm.
and his people very well. But I greatly admired him.
Mhm. Why did you end up leaving the Reagan administration?
I had a disagreement with the administration over Vietnam veterans programs, in particular Agent Orange. And the Reagan administration wanted to discontinue and dismantle the funding for epidemiological surveys and studies that would link exposure to Vietnam to adverse health effects. And I thought that was wrong. They wanted to close what was known as vet centers that had been started under Jimmy Carter, under my old friend Max Cleland, who was a triple amputee from Vietnam, who was the administrator of the Veterans Administration under Jimmy Carter. I thought that was wrong, and I couldn't support it. And the administration decided that was their policy, and I was very forthright. And I went to see Jim Baker, the president. Jim Baker was chief staff to the president at the time, and I just said, this is the administration that won the election. If that's your policy, I understand it, but I can't support it. I think it's wrong. And they later changed their policy after I left, but I thought that was the right thing to do. After I tried to make the case to have them change their policy, and they wouldn't. So I thought the honest thing to do would be to resign, and I did.
So transitioning from when you were working in government to then working in the private sector, how did you have the skills needed to run a business?
Well, I've always thought skill sets are transferable. I don't think you need a master's degree in anything to be successful. I don't think you need a degree in a particular field to be successful. I didn't ever have, I went to 5 colleges. I never took one business class. I took some basic economics classes. But I think skill sets are transferable, first of all, in thinking and being able to associate, reading, having some historical perspective, because only then do you kind of start to understand products or markets or people. But I think it is about people. You can take any specific area of products or economics, but it's people. People make decisions. People, no matter how big, good, powerful an institution is, they're only as good as the people who run them and the quality of the people. And so if you have a sense of people, and if you like people, you listen. This is another quality, listen. We don't do enough listening, especially in our foreign policy, I think, and a lot of mistakes we make in our government and others. I've often said when I was in the Senate, we ought to turn our transmitters off more and our receivers on more. And so I just tried to learn and listen, knowing that I didn't know a lot about a lot of things. But I learned from people. I listened to people. And I watched people. And I saw what I thought was the right way to do things, the wrong way to do it. and that's applicable to everything. Last point I'd make is I was fortunate to have associated myself with very good people.
Okay. What was your favorite kind of person to work with?
A person with the right attitude.
Mm-hmm.
I hired many people. I've hired hundreds of people in different jobs over the years, and all the different jobs I've had in all my career. I run a big world nonprofit organizations, public companies, started companies, run the Pentagon, which is the biggest entity in the world, the United States Senate, all the different things. The first criteria as to who I'd always like to deal with and work with are people with the right attitude. Mm-hmm. Meaning they wanted to learn, they were positive. Mm-hmm. It was never about excuses why something couldn't be done. That doesn't mean they don't disagree. Mm-hmm. You want people who will disagree. You want people who feel comfortable enough with you, who will say, well, I'm not sure we want to go this way. Mm-hmm. But I like people. And if people are not comfortable in doing their job and their relationships with other people, then that's not a good blend for me. Okay. And so I always look for that in people. Skill sets, of course. IQ is not the highest. Common sense. Mm-hmm. IQ is not the highest mm-hmm. priority. It's attitude, common sense, willingness to work hard, mm-hmm. belief in the right things, enthusiasm, and a common decency about life and respect for all people.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you're a very successful business person. What made you jump back into politics?
Well, I had never run for office before. Uh-huh. I had never been a candidate.
Okay.
And I think anybody who has run campaigns and been chiefs of staff for the members of Congress and been in the government and had high-level executive offices like I did, and I ran President Bush's G7 economic summit to President George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush. Mm-hmm. In 1990, I ran the G7 economic summit in Houston, Texas. Okay. So I've had a lot of those kind of jobs where I've run big things. Mm-hmm. But I've never been a candidate. And I've always been interested in being a candidate someday if the opportunity was right, mm-hmm. and if the environment was right mm-hmm. for my family, my business. And I was only interested ever in being a United States Senator. I was never interested in being governor, mm-hmm. Never interested in being a congressman, because congressmen, important jobs, both of them, but congressmen are 2-year terms. Mm-hmm. And I always thought a 6-year term, and everybody's different, for me was better. And so that was the only job I ever had any interest in, mm-hmm. was a senator. And so a situation arose in Nebraska where it was all kind of coming together that I thought, this might work. Mm-hmm. And there's no perfect time, because the older you get in life, the more you will realize that any one of us can talk ourselves into anything, and we can talk ourselves out of anything. And so it all just worked for me, and I decided to run for the Senate in 1995. And it was 20 years ago this year I was elected to the Senate. Mm-hmm.
When did you get to know Senator Obama, and what were your thoughts on him?
Well, he and I served together in the Senate for 4 years. Mm-hmm. He came in 2004. We served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee mm-hmm. together. Traveled with him, got to know him well, and always had a very good relationship with him, a good personal relationship. I never let any disagreement with a colleague, no matter how deep, ever get personal. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately, that line has blurred considerably today, because we now personally vilify each other, and that's wrong. I never did that, and I was fortunate when I got to the Senate that most senators were that way. Mm-hmm. You could disagree, you could strongly debate, but you respected the other person, and you never let it get personal. now you got senators on the floor of the Senate violating the Senate rules, floor rules, when they talk about each other on the floor. That's a violation of the Senate. You could be censured for that. That was just the way I dealt with all my colleagues. But I liked Obama personally. We got along very well personally. Had a good relationship personally, and I mean, obviously, he was a very, very talented person and had a lot to offer. And that was in 2008, before he was formally nominated. He asked Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island and me to go with him on a Middle East trip because he'd actually never been. He was very inexperienced. I mean, President Obama is probably the most inexperienced president we've ever elected. And he had never really spent any time in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq, or anywhere. So he asked Senator Reed and me to go with him for a week because we had been there many, many times in all those places.
So I'm curious, how does an individual normally get nominated to a cabinet role? Is it customary to express your interest, or do you ask the president for it?
Well, I think it comes in a variety of ways. I don't think there's any one way to do it. But in my case, he had asked me to co-chair the President's Intelligence Advisory Board in his first term. Mm-hmm. And I agreed to do that. I co-chaired it with a good friend, former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, former governor of Oklahoma, Dave Bourne, who's now president of the University of Oklahoma. And we did that for 4 years. I never asked for a job in the administration. Actually, the administration asked me if I would consider about 3 other jobs, senior jobs, and I turned them all down. So I never asked for a job, never wanted a job, wasn't looking for a job. Mm-hmm. So I was in Paris at a board meeting of one of the companies I was on in November of 2008, after the election. 2012, after President Obama was reelected. Mm-hmm. And I got a call one night. I was by myself in a little French bistro restaurant, having dinner by myself. Mm-hmm. And I got a call on my cell phone from the White House. And the White House operator said, is this Chuck Hagel? I said, yes. She said, well, this is the White House calling. President Obama would like to speak to you. Mm. Out of nowhere. And I'm sitting there in Paris. So I said, okay. I said, can you hold on for a moment? Mm-hmm. So I didn't want to sit there in the restaurant and take the call from the President of the United States. So I told the waiter I needed to go outside and take the call on the street. Mm-hmm. So I did. So I was out on the street talking to the President of the United States, and he asked me if I'd be interested in being Secretary of Defense. Mm-hmm. There were only 2 jobs I ever really had any interest in. Mm-hmm. That I think the administration knew it, because I had been offered a number of other very senior positions. One was Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense.
What's something you wish you had known prior to taking on the job as Defense Secretary?
You anticipate things coming at you. Mm-hmm. A year and a half later, the rise of ISIS. Nobody really saw that coming. I mean, they were all part of different terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and so on. Mm-hmm. But that also came as a result of the Iraqi army folding. 2 divisions of Iraqi soldiers in western Iraq dropped all of their weapons, got out of their tanks and ran, and let ISIS just walk in to western Iraq. No one anticipated that. So it's those kind of things that, if you go back and say, geez, I wish I would have known this was going to happen, but I just don't think that way. Things are going to come. You got to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but what's important, like anything, in any big job, prepare yourself and your institution as best you can for the unknowables, the unpredictables, and the uncontrollables, because they'll all come. Mm-hmm.
You were the first enlisted combat veteran to hold your position. How did your experience in the military help and affect you as Secretary of Defense?
Well, there wasn't a day went by, a decision that I made that I didn't call upon that experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was in Vietnam in 1968. That was the worst year for America. We sent home more than 16,000 dead Americans in 1 year. A lot of that experience I applied to, well, because I used to ask the question, which I don't think we've done very well over the years, especially when we, in my opinion, blundered into Iraq in 2003 and blundered into Afghanistan in many ways. We never asked the whole series of questions. Then what happens? Then what happens? Then what happens?
Mm-hmm.
What's your exit strategy? What's your clear objective? What are your plans to do it? Who's going to govern after you leave? How will those people be decided to govern?
Mm-hmm.
Who will make that decision? Who governs the country after we're gone? We never ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, because of my experience, I was able to apply some of that, at least, to my job. But there wasn't a day that went by in my job as Secretary of Defense for the 2 years I was there,
Mm-hmm.
February 2013 to February 2015, that time in the Army, in particular Vietnam, did not come up in my thinking and how I saw things and decisions I made.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a proudest moment or accomplishment as Secretary of Defense?
The most proud I am of something is being able to unify our services and our senior and junior, both uniform and civilian people together, and break down certain walls
Mm-hmm.
to kind of unify our thinking a little bit. And I think all those things are part of responsibility of a leader, and that also goes to probably the most fundamental responsibility of a leader, which I'm very proud of, is preparing the institution that you lead for the future.
Mm-hmm.
You want to assure in every way that the institution is better than you found it.
Mm-hmm.
When you walk out that door, you want to be able to be honest with yourself and say, no, I think I left this institution stronger than I found it. And that's not a criticism of anybody before you. I hope my successors will do this, will feel the same way, that I left it better than I found it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the way you build institutions.
Mm-hmm. For the rest of your career, what's one more lasting impact that you want to make?
But I want to continue to try to make a difference where I can. I'm associated with Georgetown University. One of my offices is there, University of Nebraska in Omaha. I do a lot with both those universities. I'm putting on a big Vietnam 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War symposium at the University of Nebraska in Omaha in late October, bringing a lot of big names back for that for 2 days. Things like that. Young people, I spend a lot of time with young people in programs. I'm on the RAND Corporation board. I'm on other boards. Give a lot of speeches around the world. Work very closely with many veterans groups, especially the young startup veterans groups from the Afghan Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
So I've tried to apply all the good things that happened to me and the investment the state of Nebraska has in me,
Mm-hmm.
and apply that somewhere where I can pay back and do things to help the state, to help the people, help young people. And I've been fortunate since I left the Senate and now left Secretary of Defense's job. Still have a lot of opportunities to do that, and that is very fulfilling. I'm done with politics, done with formal government service. If someone wants my help or my advice on something, that's great. But I'm not interested in any more jobs, and I've had enough of those. So what I'm doing now, full schedule with a lot of things, but I'm doing the things I want to do, the things I think are most important, and the people I want to do them with.
What advice would you give to students who want to go into public service today?
You ask yourself one question, and that is, why do you want to do it? And if the answer is not something similar to make a better world, then don't do it.
That's good advice. Secretary Hagel, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Andrew. Thank you very much.